All right. So I'd like to begin by saying, falling away from the law of God is nothing new. It is something that has happened throughout history. I remember when I was taking a trip in my truck going up to Minnesota. I got 16 hours to kill. I put in the Old Testament. Figure I would just listen to the Old Testament. Uh, Mostly, I started like after the first 5 books. I've been over those so many times, and I skipped some of the major prophets. But I was able to cover, most of the Old Testament in just one trip, just listening to it. And one of the things that struck me about it was that as Israel followed the law of God, they did well. They prospered, and God was with them. But eventually, and I don't know if this is just a Israelitish thing, of course, which we're a part of, or if it's something that's common to human nature, but they would eventually fall away from the law of God. And it seemed to be one of these roller coaster up and down through the Old Testament. As the leaders went, so did the rest of the tribes of Israel, and so did the people of God at that time. And so whenever we look at today's subject, I guess it really shouldn't be anything new to us, and it shouldn't come as a shock that there's problems and there's controversies concerning us around when we're supposed to keep the Passover. It even has a name that it's become such a controversy. It's called the Quartodeciman theory, which just means the 14 theory. And what happened is that there's some people that believe that you should keep Passover on the 14th, and there's some that believe that you should keep it on the 15th. So today, I'd like to go through and look at what the Bible has to say and see if we can come to some conclusions on which day we are to keep today. Is it the 14th or is it the 15th? Let's begin in Exodus 12, if you would, Exodus 12 and verse 1, with the original Passover. This is the original Passover when it happened, the actual passing over in Exodus 12. We begin in verse 1. And I'll be reading mostly from the New King James today. It says, "Now the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, This month shall be your beginning of months." It's the first month. "It shall be the first month of the year to you. Speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, On the 10th of this month, every man shall take for himself a lamb, according to the house of his father, a lamb for a household." So again, this is God speaking to Moses and Aaron. This is their instructions that they're giving. And he said, okay, on the 10th, this is what you need to do. Then continuing in verse 4, he says, "If the household is too small for the lamb, let him and his neighbor next to his house take it according to the number of the persons. According to each man's need, you shall count. Make your count for the lamb." Verse 5, "Your lamb shall be without blemish, a male of the first year. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats." Now, verse 6, "Now you shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month. Then the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it at twilight." So it seems pretty straightforward. Yet, there can be some issues concerning what twilight actually means. And this is where, again, some of the controversy comes. But we know that God begins the day at sunset. But let's go ahead and take a quick look, if you would, at Deuteronomy 16, verse 6, to see more specifically what the word twilight, or how this word is defined. As we were talking about before services, there's a lot of different definitions for words, and sometimes the translators take certain liberties maybe they shouldn't, or maybe certain ones that they see, and they try to define it. But sometimes it's helpful, sometimes it's not. But let's let the Bible interpret the Bible and see what we have here in verse 6 of Deuteronomy 16. "But at the place where the Lord your God chooses to make his name abide, there you shall sacrifice the Passover at twilight, at the going down of the sun, at the time you came out of Egypt." So here we have a definition, as it were, of when this is supposed to take place. It's at the going down of the sun. And this word right here for twilight is the same exact word in Exodus 12 and verse 6. And so in context, we see that this is at the beginning of the day as God reckons. That's when a day begins. So let's go back to Exodus 12 and verse 6. So this word that's translated twilight in the New King James Version is actually translated between the evenings in the King James Version. And also in the Young's literal translation, it says it was slaughtered between the evenings. Again, this has caused some problems as well in the past. But basically, simply, between the evenings is a time between sundown and dark. So the word twilight, or the phrase between the two evenings, refers to that time right after sunset, but before it gets dark. So as you know, when the sun sets, it's not dark outside because you got the sun reflecting off the sky before it gets behind the curvature of the earth. And so you still have a little bit of light to get around. And this is the time when this was to be done. So after sundown, but before it got dark, you were supposed to slaughter the lamb here, as it says in Exodus 12 and verse 6. Now, as we continue, we see that they were actually to eat the lamb. Verse 7. But let's see, in verse 7 it says, and they shall take some of the blood and put it, this is after they slaughtered it, put it on the two doorposts and on the lintel of the houses where they eat it. Then they shall eat the flesh on that night. Right, so remember what we're talking about here is, okay, we're trying to figure out whether it's the 14th or the 15th that you're supposed to observe Passover on. So on the 14th, after twilight, they had slaughtered the animal, the lamb, and then on that night, they were to eat it, according to verse 8. So they killed it just before at the beginning of the 14th, just right after the 14th began, right at twilight, just after sunset, and they were told to eat it that very same night. So of course this makes perfect sense and goes hand in hand with the next verses. In verse 10, you shall let none of it remain until morning, and what remains of it until morning you shall burn with fire, and thus you shall eat it. And they were also instructed how to eat it because of what was going to happen in the near future. He says, with a belt on your waist, sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand, so you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. All right, so keep this phrase in mind. All right, and we'll come back to that just a little bit later. So now notice what happened on that night and subsequently what the Israelites did on that night. So we're still talking about the beginning of the 14th, right? Verse 12, for I will pass through the land of Egypt on that night and will strike all their firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast. Against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. Now the blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are. When I see the blood, I will pass over you. Hence the name Passover. I will pass over your house. You will become exempt from what the death angel is about to do. And the plague shall not be on you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. So the Israelites were in their homes eating the Passover lamb, and they were benefiting from this protection that was being afforded them because they put the blood on the doorpost and on the lintel. This was all still, remember, on the 14th. And that is the time from sunset until morning. That's what we've been talking about. Now we'll see this a little more clearly in verse 21 when Moses begins to pass on the instructions to the people. So remember, first it was God talking to Moses and Aaron. Now it's Moses here is talking to the people. In verse 21, Moses called for all the elders of Israel and said to them, pick out and take lambs for yourselves according to your families and kill the Passover lamb. You shall take a bunch of hyssop, dip it in the blood that is in the basin, and strike the lintel and the two doorposts with the blood that is in the basin. And none of you shall go out of the door of this house until morning. For the Lord will pass through and strike the Egyptians when he sees the blood on the lintel and the two on the doorpost. The Lord will pass over the door and not allow the destroyer to come into your houses to strike you. So they did this. They sacrificed the lamb. They put the blood on the doorpost, and they were to remain in their homes throughout that night of the 14th, right? If they were to come out, they would have suffered the same punishment that the Egyptians suffered. But as we know, many of the Israelites left, and so they obviously did this. So after all the firstborn had been killed, finally the Pharaoh relented. And of course, as we know, this was the 10th and final plague on the Egyptians. And so uh, Pharaoh at this point had enough, and he says, okay, you guys get out of here. In fact, the Egyptians were anxious, as you can imagine, and they were hurrying them out of town. All right, so let's pick up the story in verse 33 of Exodus 12. And you see that the Egyptians urged the people that they might send them out of the land in haste, for they said, we shall all be dead. So after all that they had been through with the 10 plagues, this no doubt seemed like a logical assumption that they were going to be dead if they just didn't, get rid of the Egyptians or the Israelites right away. So we have to remember that what takes place here couldn't have happened before the morning of the 14th, because they were inside their homes that whole time. And I know that this might be a little laborious and that we're going over and over it, but there are reasons, because there are others who say, well, no, this night that they're talking about refers to the night of the 14th when it began. But as we see, that cannot be the possibility. Otherwise, they would have never left, because they would have been dead. They would have been killed by the death angel had they come out before morning. So now we are moving towards the day portion of the 14th. So we've already been through from the beginning of the 14th, which began at sunset, through that night. Now we're at morning, to where they had to stay in the home until that time. So verse 34, the people took their dough, again, just right, the morning, before it was leavened, in other words, it was unleavened, having their kneading bowls bound up in their clothes on their shoulders. Now the children of Israel had done according to the word of Moses. They had asked for the Egyptians articles of silver, articles of gold, and clothing. This all happened during the daylight hours of the day of the 14th, the day of Passover. That's the time when they made haste to get out of Egypt at the urging of the Egyptians, in addition to taking the spoils. They had made their unleavened bread for the journey. This was now happening. All this stuff, the spoiling, the plundering, and the making of the unleavened bread, was happening during the day of the 14th. Now, verse 36 of Exodus 12. The Lord had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they granted them what they requested. Thus they plundered the Egyptians. This was happening at this point because of everything that had transpired with the 10 previous, and specifically the 10th plague of killing their firstborns. Had the Egyptians not been in that state of mind, they wouldn't have given them all that they had asked for. So again, this goes to show that this is not the night before all the children, the firstborn, were killed, and not just children, but all the firstborn were killed. But this had to happen after. There was no way that the Egyptians would have given them that stuff just for no reason. Then verse 37, then the children of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Succoth. So then it was after that they took off. And then verse 39, they baked unleavened cakes of the dough which they had brought out of Egypt, for it was not leavened. And of course, this has all of the other meanings that we're not getting into at the moment, because they were driven out of Egypt. Of course, this was at the urging of the grief-stricken and the downtrodden Egyptians. And they could not wait, nor had they prepared provisions for themselves. Now, skipping down to verse 42, we see it is a night of solemn observance to the Lord for bringing them out of the land of Egypt. This has to be the next night. It cannot be the previous night. This is the night of the 15th. So this solemn observance for bringing them out of the land of Egypt, this night to be much observed, to be much remembered, this solemn observance for all the children of Israel throughout their generations, as verse 42 says. So this had to be the next night, because the previous night they were still, they were slaughtering the lamb, staying in their home, eating the lamb, and not coming out till morning. So the night that they left Egypt had to be the next night after Passover. And that was the beginning, the first day of unleavened bread, as we know. Let's skip back up to verse 17. Exodus 12 of verse 17. And we'll see that it happened exactly like God told them it would happen. So you shall observe the feast of unleavened bread, for on this same day I will have brought your armies out of the land of Egypt. Therefore you shall observe this day throughout your generations as an everlasting ordinance. So this is exactly what God said was going to happen. This is the way that he made it happen, and it is the way that it did happen. That it was on the first day of unleavened bread that they left Egypt. It was not on Passover night. So Passover was the 14th. First day of unleavened bread was the 15th. And that is when they left. So to me, that all seems fairly clear, fairly straightforward. And this is the original Passover. Let's go ahead and turn to Leviticus 23, where we have the holy days, and begin in verse 5. Leviticus 23 and verse 5. I'll read down through verse 8. It says, on the 14th day of the first month at twilight, that's the same word we talked about before, is the Lord's Passover. So note the phraseology again. It's called the Lord's Passover, and we'll get to that in a little bit. Verse 6, and on the 15th day of the same month is the feast of unleavened bread to the Lord. 7 days you must eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall have a holy convocation. Do no customary work on it, but you shall offer an offering made by fire to the Lord for 7 days. The 7th day shall be a holy convocation. You shall do no customary work on it. So here it says that Passover is on the 14th day, and the Feast of Unleavened Bread begins on the 15th day. So to me, verse 5 says, if you want to get rid of maybe some of the little parenthetical thought, it says on the 14th is the Lord's Passover. So you can get rid of the other stuff and just concatenate the sentence there. Then you see it says the 14th is the Lord's Passover. So if it wasn't to take place until after sunset at the end of the 14th, then that would actually be the 15th, and you'd call it the 15th, not the 14th, and it would be written that way. So while we're here, let's just take a quick look at verse 32, and it just shows how a day is defined in terms of beginning and ending. It says, it shall be a Sabbath to you of solemn rest, and you shall afflict your souls on the 9th day of the month at evening. From evening to evening you shall celebrate your Sabbath. So here we're talking about the way that, again, that Sabbath is defined, and we're doing this. We'll just, since we're here, go ahead and define it, since we were talking about it before. So we see here in Leviticus 23 that Passover is the 14th, and the 15th is the beginning of unleavened bread, just as we've seen in Exodus 12. So as we move through the Old Testament, we can see that God's people continue to observe Passover on the 14th of the month. Let's go ahead and look at Moses, what he did 1 year later in Numbers 9. And we'll breeze through these examples, have 4 examples. We'll breeze through them pretty quickly. But here we are 1 year later, and naturally we would assume that Moses would still be keeping the Passover, especially since, I don't think we read it there in Exodus 12, but in verse 24 it said that this would be an ordinance forever. And so here we are 1 year later, not quite forever yet. So we're assuming that he's going to be keeping it. And sure enough, he is. Now the Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the first month of the 2nd year, after they had come out of the land of Egypt, saying, let the children of Israel keep Passover at its appointed time. And when was the appointed time? Verse 3, on the 14th day of this month, at twilight. You shall keep it at its appointed time according to all its rites and ceremonies. You shall keep it. And so Moses told the children of Israel that they should keep the Passover, and they kept the Passover on the 14th day of the first month at twilight in the wilderness of Sinai, according to all that the Lord commanded. So the children of Israel did. Joshua, let's turn to Joshua 5, verses 9 and 10. The mantle was passed to Joshua from Moses, and he continued in the way that he was taught. Joshua 5, verse 9 and 10. Then the Lord said to Joshua, this day I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you. Therefore, the name of this place is called Gilgal to this day. Now the children of Israel camped in Gilgal and kept the Passover on the 14th day of the month at twilight on the plains of Jericho. So we have now Moses and Joshua. Let's look at Josiah now. If you want, you can start turning over to 2 Chronicles 35. But like we were talking about before, it seems that God's people have had this proclivity to ebb and flow when it comes to keeping the law of God. And we find one of these transitions with Josiah, who was made king at a very young age. And maybe that even contributed to the fact that he actually kept the law. He was, like a little child and had that heart to do that. But there was a revival under King Josiah. And if you remember the story, the book of the law that was found in the house of the Lord was given to the scribe, and he read it to Josiah. And Josiah said, okay, yeah, we, that being at that time the kingdom of Judah, need to do this. We need to start keeping the laws of God, because they were not doing that. And at that time, the kingdom of Judah was comprised of Judah, Benjamin, and parts of Levi. So this is who he was leading at that time, because the Israelites had already gone into captivity with the Assyrians. So in 2 Chronicles 35, let's read verses 18 and 19. And said, there had been no Passover kept in Israel like that since the days of Samuel. So this is what I'm talking about. They kept it at one point, and now they were not keeping it, and then here they are keeping it again. And none of the kings of Israel had kept such a Passover as Josiah kept, with the priests and the Levites, all Judah and Israel who were present, and all the inhabitants of Jerusalem. In the 18th year of the reign of Josiah, this Passover was kept. So if I remember my numbers, that make him about 26 or so when he was doing this. Now notice back up in verse 1, when Josiah kept the Passover as prescribed by the law that he had found. Now Josiah kept a Passover to the Lord in Jerusalem, and they slaughtered the Passover lambs on the 14th day of the first month. Now, as we move on, we find that this revival didn't last for very long, and the curses that God had suspended upon the nation of Judah were re-implemented, and Babylon actually ended up taking Judah into captivity. So after their release from captivity, they began rebuilding the temple. And so let's pick up this story in Ezra 6 and verse 15. Ezra 6 and verse 15. And so now we see that the temple was finished on the 3rd day of the month of Adar, which was in the 6th year of the reign of King Darius, or Darius. So this puts out around 520 to 515 BC. So they assigned the priests to their divisions and the Levites to their divisions over the service of God in Jerusalem, as it is written in the book of Moses. And the descendants of the captivity kept the Passover on the 14th day of the first month. So for the priests and the Levites had purified themselves, all of them were ritually clean, and they slaughtered the Passover lambs for all the descendants of the captivity, for their brethren, the priests, and for themselves. So what we have now here is a long history of the Israelites and then the Jews. After the northern 10 tribes went into their captivity and were scattered, of them keeping the Passover on the 14th. And to me, it's interesting here in Ezra that they kept the Passover on the 14th day of the first month. You'll notice that there's no twilight there. So if twilight was ever an issue for you, or if it's still an issue for you, then you see that here they are, Ezra is keeping it, and it simply says it, and even was saying it in with Josiah too. What did it say in Josiah? Said that they kept Passover to the Lord in Jerusalem, and they slaughtered the Passover lambs on the 14th day of the first month. So it happened on the 14th day. So to me, that clears it up if it wasn't clear before if there was something. And this is what was prescribed, as he said in the book of Moses. Of course, one of the main reasons that we're looking at this is because there came a time when the Jews specifically started keeping Passover on the 15th of the first month, which I think most of them still do to this day. So after 1,000 years of keeping it at the right time, so back from the Exodus all the way to here we are, the time of Ezra, which again was probably around the time of 520 to 515 BC, that they were keeping it as prescribed. So the thing is that it's not exactly clear when this happened or how it exactly happened that there was this move to the 15th. But most of the data leads to this change happening around 300 to 200 BC, when the Jews were under Egyptian control again. Now, this is not the one that they left at the time of the Exodus, so this is another one. And it was believed that at the beginning and the ending of days became closer to the way that we look at days nowadays. Most people nowadays don't look at the day beginning at sunset. And this was changed, I think, for them to a large degree because of their captivity. While they may have been allowed to keep some of their holy days, their feast days, they were not, they still, took on some of the things around it. And this is to a certain degree speculation because it's not exactly known when the shift happened, but we do know that it happened before Christ came onto the scene. And it happened after what we're seeing here in the time of Ezra. And so the issue may very well have been that once they started beginning the day in the morning, then all of a sudden this term of twilight, it lost a certain amount of meaning. So if you begin your day, the day begins on the 14th in the morning time, then you look, we're supposed to do this at twilight of the 14th, then they may have been looking at it in terms of the way we would look at it, that, okay, it would be the 14th right before it became, the 15th is the way God reckons it. So anyway, nonetheless, however it happened, it happened. And if you could turn to John 2:13, we find a specific term that appears actually several times in the Bible. And I think has caused other confusion outside of the confusion that we're talking about. John 2 in verse 13, it says, "Now the Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem." So now remember what I was asking you to keep in mind, the phraseology? It was called the Lord's Passover, not the Jews' Passover. The Passover doesn't belong to just the physical Jews. Okay? The holy days are God's holy days. They're not the Jews' holy days. Right? They're God's. He's the one that gave them. He's the one that ordained them. They belong to him, and he orchestrated them for a reason. So now, one of the things I think I was accused of in the past is that I was keeping the Jewish holy days. And when I was a kid in school, you keep the Jewish holy days. I'm going, well, no, that's not what I keep. I keep God's holy days. Now, this right here may have been why some people say, it's the Jewish Passover. Well, this was used specifically for this reason. The Jews were keeping Passover at this point in this time on the 15th of the first month, not on the 14th. So we'll look at that and we'll see this a little more clearly as we go along. And so whenever they say this, the Jewish Passover, the Passover of Jews, there is a differentiation here. And this is what causes a lot of the confusion in the New Testament. So when we look at the New Testament, again, looking at the New Testament, I feel to a certain degree is redundant. I think we've already proven it from the Old Testament when we're supposed to keep it. But we're going to go ahead and look at when Christ kept it. When did the Messiah keep it? You would figure if there's somebody who knows when to keep Passover, it's going to be him, right? The Son of God. So let's turn to Matthew 26 and verse 17, and we'll begin, and we won't spend an awful lot of time, but we'll briefly look at the Passover. And I think most of us know the whole story, so we'll kind of skip through it fairly quickly. But let's put some things in order and just make some delineations and some points here. Of course, now we have to start off with a problem in Matthew 26, verse 17, and this is what contributes to some of the confusion. Now on the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, where the disciples came to Jesus, saying to him, where do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Passover? So when you look at that, you're going, okay, well, it looks like the first day of unleavened bread is Passover. And it doesn't look like there's actually any referring to the Jewish Passover. So it looks like they're saying, okay, well, we're going to keep it on the first day of unleavened bread, which is the 15th. Well, first off, if you have a version that shows it in italics, you'll see that day of the feast is not actually a part of that sentence. The translators put it in there to quote unquote make it more clear. And this is one of those instances where it doesn't make it helpful at all. So if you look at it, it says, now on the first of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus. Then I said, okay, well, that's not nearly as specific. Let's look at this word first as well. The word first can also, it can be specific or general in its term. Let's turn over, please, to 2 Peter 2:20. I want to show you where this word is translated another way. 2 Peter 2:20, and it's the same exact word as this word first here. Another thing we also obviously have to keep in mind too is that, okay, well, we've already been through the Old Testament and, I think substantially proved that it's the 14th. So what's going on here? How do we reconcile this? In 2 Peter 2:20, it says, for if after they have escaped the pollutions of the world through the knowledge of the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, they are entangled therein and overcome the latter end, and then is worse with them than the beginning. Than the beginning is the same exact word. It is more of a general type of description of what is going on as opposed to an exact. So when you realize that the word day and feast of are not in the original, and that this word first may be and is too specific, you can see then that maybe the translation is more understandable is if you go now at the beginning of unleavened bread, or say toward the beginning of unleavened bread, in terms of Matthew 26 and verse 17, the disciples came to Jesus saying, where will you that we prepare to eat the Passover? Then all of a sudden it says, okay, well, now that kind of fits with what we're saying. Not only does it fit with what we're saying, we're not molding this around to the way we want to be. As we go through this, we'll see that it actually was a different day. This was not the same day as the first day of unleavened bread. So what we have here is more of a gross mistranslation of this verse, which is misleading and was not understood by the ones who translated this. So this should become clear as we go through that these two were definitely two separate days, and Christ was keeping Passover on the 14th, not on the 15th, which was the first day of unleavened bread. So let's look at it again. Now I'll go ahead and just kind of use this translation and say, now toward the beginning of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus saying, where will you that we prepare for you to eat the Passover? In verse 18, he said, go into the city to a certain man and say to him, the teacher says, my time is at hand. I will keep the Passover, okay, Pascha, or as we know, like the Paschal lamb, at your house with my disciples. Verse 19, so the disciples did as Jesus directed, and they prepared the Passover. So this is what they're doing. They're preparing the Passover. And when evening had come, all right, when evening had come, he sat down with the 12, just like we talked about, the Israelites doing, and the way that God said to do it, and the way that God's people did it for the next 1,000 years. So he sat down with the 12. Then in verse 36, as we move through the story, we find that Jesus came with them after the meal and whatnot to Gethsemane. And, Christ said, sit here while I go and pray over there. And then verse 47, we move on a little bit further, and it says, while he was still speaking, behold, Judas, who we know that left during the meal, after Christ gave him the sop. Behold, Judas, one of the 12, with a great multitude with swords and clubs, came from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now his betrayer, speaking of Judas, had given them a sign saying, whomever I kiss, he is the one. Seize him. Immediately he went up to Jesus and said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and kissed him. And Jesus said to him, "Friend, why have you come?" And then they laid hands on Jesus and took him. So we're seeing, okay, he prayed in the night. These guys came and they took him later in that night. And then the next morning, the Jews brought Jesus before the Sanhedrin. Let's turn to John 18 and verse 28. And stick with me because we're just going through the timeline very quickly here to show that Christ was doing this the night before. All right, and he did that during the night. He prayed. Then they came a little bit later and they took him. And then, early in the morning, they led Jesus from Caiaphas to the praetorium. And it was early morning. But they themselves did not go into the praetorium, lest they should be defiled. Why is it that they didn't want to be defiled? So that they could eat the Passover. Okay, so what's going on here? They're talking about eating the Passover still in the future. They didn't want to be defiled by going into the praetorium here, so that they could keep the Jewish Passover, which was the 15th. That's when they kept their Passover, on the first day of unleavened bread, and that's what they didn't want to be defiled for. So we've seen, okay, again, just recount real quick. They had the Passover. We saw that they had the Passover that night. Christ went and prayed. They came and took him right after that. Early in the morning, he goes before them. Then the Jews come so that they can keep their Passover. They don't want to be defiled so that they can keep their Passover. And one of the specific reasons that they didn't take Christ on their Passover was, we find in Matthew, I'll just read it for you. In Matthew 26, verse 5, it says, "But they said, not during the feast, lest there be an uproar among the people." That is why they didn't want to take Christ on their Passover. So they took it on the 14th thinking, oh, this will be okay. Not knowing that they were unwittingly fulfilling everything to the letter of the T so that Christ might become the Passover. John 19 and verse 30, we'll read verse 30 and 31, just a chapter over. John 19, verses 30 and 31. So when Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, "It is finished." Bowing his head, he gave up the spirit. So that was about 3 in the afternoon, or the 9th hour, as they called it. And then verse 31, "Therefore, because it was the preparation day." What's the preparation day? The preparation day is the day before a Sabbath, when you prepare so that you don't have to work on the Sabbath. Okay? That the bodies should not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, for that Sabbath was not just a regular Sabbath, but it was a high day. It was one of the holy days. In fact, it was the first day of unleavened bread. And the Jews asked Pilate that their legs might be broken, that they might be taken away. So they wanted to hurry up and get him in the ground so that they wouldn't be, quote unquote, breaking the Sabbath. And so what we have here then is that Christ ends up dying before the first day of unleavened bread, before the high day. They didn't have to break his legs, just as the Israelites did not and were not supposed to break any of the bones of the lamb. Back in Exodus 12, there was a scripture about that we didn't read. But his legs were not broken because he had already died. And now they're going to get him into the ground before it becomes Sabbath. So here it is, Jesus Christ, our Passover, died on Passover the 14th. And so he had celebrated Passover, given them the New Testament symbols, the new symbols that they were supposed to keep now instead of the old. And he went through the trial, the mistrial, the unlawful trial, whatever you want to call it, and was put, and hung, with his hands and feet nailed, and he died about 3 in the afternoon on Passover the 14th. So thus becoming the Passover on Passover. So whenever we read through this, just kind of as to back up, we can see that the Jewish Passover, as referred to several times in the Bible, is another day. It's a time when the law got mishandled or misunderstood, or the people got away. And typically that's what happens, is that when you get away from keeping the commands, you don't understand the commands. You don't understand the law of God. And so because of one thing that led to another, the Jews began keeping it on the 15th. And they got, obviously, as far as I'm concerned, and from everything I can see and everything I can tell, and what to me seems to be plain and straightforward, they got away from the 14th and started keeping it on the 15th. So I'll go ahead and end it there.